some more folks coming into the waiting room as we go along, but we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Roland McReynolds. I'm Executive Director at the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. We really appreciate you joining us for this workshop session on the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program 2. We are really happy to have a couple of great presenters from the Farmers Legal Action Group here with us today to talk with you about this USDA program, which really could be of some significant value as in terms of a disaster relief for small farms and direct market farms that have been damaged or suffered injury due to the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. First of all, we've got Stephen Carpenter, who is Deputy Director and Senior Staff Attorney at the Farmers Legal Action Group. He's a graduate of the Stanford Law School and has been working with Farmers Legal Action Group since 1993. His work centers on discrimination in agricultural lending, debtor-creditor issues, disaster assistance, federal farm programs, and sustainable agriculture and direct marketing. He's also served as senior counsel in the Office of the Monitor in the Pigford versus Glickman litigation, and is a court-appointed ombudsman for the In re Black Farmers discrimination case. We also have with us from FLAG, Lindsay Keane, who is a staff attorney. She's also a former pig farmer. She joined FLAG in the summer of 2017 and got her law degree from Arkansas, and she also worked at Heifer International. Her degree is, she also has a master's in public service from the Clinton School of Public Service and clerked for district court judge in Hennepin County before joining FLAG. Thank you both very much for being here, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Roland. I'm Stephen Carpenter. My colleague Lindsay Keane you'll hear from just in a moment. I wanted to just take a second and tell you a little bit about Farmers Legal Action Group. We're a nonprofit law firm that works on behalf of family farmers. We've been around since the 80s. We're going to talk today about a USDA program, and though I guess like everybody else in our world, we will apply for USDA grants on various things. We kind of want you to know that we are not USDA, and certainly USDA does not think we're USDA, given some of the things we say and do regarding them. We would love to work with good USDA folks, but we are not here to just promote USDA. We're here for family farmers, and we're here for Carolinians, North and South. So what we're going to do today is talk about what people are now calling CFAP 2. We're going to talk about the eligibility for farmers, the commodities, how the payments work, kind of what happens after you sign up, down, the sort of various things that USDA can do and can't do, what your right to be for an appeal. We're going to try to go front to back. We are about to publish, we think on Monday, maybe it will be Tuesday, a farmer's guide to CFAP 2, and it will be a long, detailed, I just have to remind people, dry as dust guide to the program with footnotes that sort of tell you how we reached the conclusions we reached. And if you look at that, we hope that will answer some detailed questions. So what you're going to get from us today is a bit of an overview, and we encourage you to take a look at the guide that will be online at Farmers Legal Action Group. We are happy to answer questions both here, if we have a few enough people, but we can go unmute and talk, or please list questions that you might have in the chat, and it'll take us a minute maybe to get to them, but we will take a look at those. And also, we're quite curious to know kind of who's on and what you're up to and why you're interested in CFAP 2. We understand that there's some service provider folks that there are farmers, and again, it just kind of helps us to know what people are up to. And one of the last things you'll see before we close up is our contact information. We're also not hard to find on our website. And we encourage you to follow up with questions later. We're really just going to give you the kind of a summary view here and talk about questions. And so please feel free to follow up with us if you have questions. So with that said, as I say, we're going to do a little bit of a summary of CFAP 1 and 2. Then we're going to go on to eligibility questions, both for farmers and for the commodities themselves, and take a look at how people are getting paid and how this thing actually works out, and take it from there. So again, it's called the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. There have been 2 such programs, and everyone's calling it CFAP, so we'll do that too. Earlier this year, there was a CFAP program. There was a big sign up, and that's essentially closed. I mean, I don't want to go into too many details, but it's essentially closed, and you can't apply, pretty much cannot apply for it anymore. But what's happened is that now we have what people are calling CFAP 2. And what I really want to emphasize before we start is that though the names are similar, the programs are really quite different. And so if you took a look at CFAP 1 and you thought, oh, yikes, this is just not for me, we would suggest that you look at it, the CFAP 2, and kind of make sure that it's still not going to work for you. There are a number of differences. We are not going to dwell on those differences today. You can sign up for CFAP 2. So CFAP 2 is what we're going to talk about. But please be aware that CFAP 1 is, in many ways, is quite different from CFAP 2. So mainly positive, but I wouldn't say completely. So with that said, let's just say straight off, CFAP 2 is a USDA program. There is a lot of money there that is going to go directly to farmers. This is not a loan. It's not like some of the SBA programs that you may have heard about, where maybe it's forgiven, maybe not, part of it's a loan. No, this is all a check to the farmer. And I'll say again, it's real money. This is not just a little bit of a slushing around of cash. This is USDA estimates about $14 billion. So it's real money. It's going to people. Checks are being cashed. So it's there. Let's talk just for a second about how the 2 interact, the 2 CFAPs. First of all, it's worth repeating again, it's for almost everybody too late to try to get into CFAP 1. But what is the relationship between the 2? And it's this. If you applied for CFAP 1, you will not be automatically enrolled in CFAP 2. You have to go do the application again. You do an application again. It's a different program. It's worth emphasizing again. So you're going to have to apply again. Do not assume, just because you were in CFAP 1 and everything seemed to go fine, that you're going to be automatically enrolled in CFAP 2. You have to do it separately. In addition, if you did not do CFAP 1, you never walked into an office, you never sent in anything, you never talked to them on the phone, you can still apply for CFAP 2. It's completely separate. You can just do it. And in fact, even if you apply for CFAP 1 and for some reason were denied, it has no bearing on what happens in CFAP 2. So again, if you think it's a possibility for you, do not be discouraged by any of the rules of CFAP 1 or whether you were in CFAP 1. It's really okay just to go ahead and go for it in CFAP for CFAP 2. As I said, there's a lot of money involved. Again, $14 billion. One of the things that people sometimes ask is, well, is this first come, first served program? And USDA will tell you no. They expect all of anybody who's eligible to get paid. And they are basing that, however, on calculations of how much they think people will take. So I'm hopeful they're right, but my take on it, just, this is not a legal view really, is that if they actually run out, USDA will probably try to find some money, other called CCC money, or Congress will appropriate more money. I will be surprised if they run out, but I think you have to say it's not impossible. So all things being equal, go ahead and apply sooner rather than later. Get all your stuff in. It's not like you should do just sort of a half application just to get it in. But I think, again, this is not what USDA kind of wants people to say, but you just never ever know. And so they, again, say it's not a first come, first serve, but being lawyerly types, Lindsay and I are going to caution you that that's not absolutely for sure. So let's talk about who can participate in this program. Who are the eligible farmers, or what USDA would call an eligible producer? After we do that, Lindsay's going to talk about the commodities that are eligible. So for CFAP 2, you need to be, as I say, an eligible producer. Well, who is an eligible producer? You can be a person. So if you're just farming by yourself without what a lawyer would call an entity, you can be eligible. So you can be eligible if you're a citizen of the United States. You can be eligible if you're what people will often call a resident alien, having what, again, people sometimes call a green card. And also, actually, you can be what USDA calls a foreign person. And interestingly, as we write it, and we've read it very closely, we think that technically undocumented immigrants cannot be refused based on their immigrant status. Whether people would want to apply and go through the process is, I understand that's something people need to weigh out themselves. But perhaps surprisingly, we don't think that you are ineligible if you're undocumented. So first of all, who's eligible for this program? Individual farmers, individual human beings. Also, though, you can be eligible if you are an entity. So that means if your farm is a partnership, as an LLC, some other form of corporation, if you're a tribal entity, all of this can be eligible. You can actually be eligible if you're a cooperative, although you have to, in each of these cases, you have to meet all the other requirements. And we think few cooperatives will be eligible. Really, the eligibility involving a cooperative is going to be the farmers themselves who are members of the cooperative that are generally going to be the ones to be eligible, and not the cooperative itself. But there's no barrier to a cooperative that meets all the requirements to be eligible. And actually, other strange entities that you might have come up with to organize your farm should be eligible as well. If they're legal in your state, they're probably legal according to USDA. So the first thing to be eligible, you need to be an eligible producer. A second thing you need is that when you're growing a commodity, crop, livestock, whatever it might be, you need to share in the risk of that production. And so that's kind of a fancy way of saying, if things go haywire, you are at least in part left holding the bag. So if your crop doesn't go, it's your loss. If your livestock get harmed or die, it's your loss. USDA wants you to have a share in the risk. So really, who gets excluded by this is, let's say, what you really do is custom work for pay. You're not eligible if that's all that you do. Or if you're a landowner and rent your farm out for cash to somebody who produces a crop. The person who rents out your land is likely eligible, but just because you're a landowner where there's farm production does not make you eligible. You need to share in the risk of the crop. Third thing that needs to be true is that you need to have an ownership interest in that crop. So again, it's sort of a legal term, ownership interest. Basically, you have to own at least part of the commodity. It doesn't have to be all of it, but you have to have it. If you're raising poultry, you have to have at least a part ownership of those birds. Same for fruits and vegetables. And so the question is not whether you own the farmland where the production takes place, it's whether you own the commodity itself. A fourth thing that has to be true, and this is of course relevant in the Carolinas, is that you cannot be a contract grower for the commodity for which you're seeking eligibility. And so people often divide contracts that farmers use into two categories. So for many people, what you have is what is often called a marketing contract. And a marketing contract just says a farmer will deliver to school X crates of tomatoes of certain quality and size. And all the contract says is you will deliver. Those are marketing contracts, and you are perfectly likely to be eligible if you have a marketing contract. On the other hand, however, if you have what people often call production contracts, and what we really mean here are the very common poultry contracts with the big integrators, or similarly hog contracts with integrated processors, where you don't own the animals, you're not going to be eligible here. I mean, the rules that USDA published are a little bit, maybe even more than a little bit confusing, I think. But the bottom line here is that if you do not have an ownership interest in the commodity, you're not going to be eligible, and it's going to be in part because of this contract rule. Also, you have to be entitled to a share of the proceeds. So again, I mean, if you think about your typical poultry contract, you're getting paid by some sort of a formula that doesn't have anything to do necessarily with what the integrator charges for the birds. So again, to avoid this contract production problem, you have to have an ownership interest, and you have to be entitled to a share in the proceeds of the product. A fifth thing that needs to be true for you to be an eligible producer is that you need to be in the business of farming at the time that you apply. And it sounds a little strange, but basically what they're getting at here is that if you leave farming today, you can't apply for CFAP 2 next week. You have to continue to be farming. And that's more relevant if you think about it to somebody, say, who's dairying, you know, where there are these sort of everyday tasks and you sell the cows, it's over. But that is a requirement that USDA has. Also, there's some things that are less important or less likely to trip people up. I'm just going to mention them very quickly. You have to meet conservation compliance requirements at USDA. If you're familiar with USDA and have worked with USDA before, you're going to know what that means. If you're not, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, you're going to have to do a form on conservation compliance. There's an adjusted gross income rule. So any of you out there who are fortunate enough to make $900,000 a year are likely not going to be eligible for CFAP 2. There are controlled substance rules that they're actually a little bit complicated. If you get tripped up by that, send us an email and we'll help you work through it. You're going to have to file an acreage report with USDA, and that's again sort of just being a part of USDA's system. I think the thing to emphasize is that you do not need to have worked with USDA in the past. You can do all this for the first time now. It's going to be more paperwork, it's going to be more of a headache, but there's no reason you can't do it. And in fact, if you are ever going to do a USDA program, now may well be the time, because this is real money that can hopefully help you. What else? Oh, and just, I know there are sort of a lot of interesting local programs, just to add to make sure people know. You can't apply if you're a public school or if you're a government entity. And we know that there are sort of various projects along those lines. So with that, that's farmer eligibility. Lindsay, tell us about commodity eligibility, please.
Thanks, Stephen, and hello, everyone. I'm Lindsay. I'm Stephen's colleague at FLAG. Happy to be with you all today. So I'm going to spend a few minutes going through sort of the requirements for eligibility for the various categories of commodities, and then also how each of these categories of commodities pays out. I think that's probably a big question for many farmers or people considering applying for the program. So the first thing, and I know Stephen emphasized this at the beginning, but when we think about CFAP 1 versus CFAP 2, I think one of the greater differences is that there are many more commodities that are eligible under CFAP 2. And so I think, again, if you had looked at CFAP 1 before, kind of, I would put that out of your mind and just make sure that you're checking to see if you would be eligible under CFAP 2. So in general, there's a few basic requirements for commodity eligibility. The general ones, first, it has to be a commodity, and we'll go over this in a bit, but that includes various crops and livestock, but it has to be produced in the United States. So that's the first thing. The second is it has to be intended to be marketed for commercial production. And that's a pretty clear rule, though I do want to point out, it's interesting when you kind of start reading the rules that USDA publishes. There is one rule in particular that Stephen and I want to just kind of put out there and let you all know it exists. And that rule says that an ineligible commodity is a garden, both commercial and home. And so I just want to point this out because it's confusing to Steve and I, to be honest. And we want to let you know that it's in the rules. And what's confusing about it is clearly if something has to be marketed for commercial production, it would make sense that a home garden is not eligible for CFAP 2. I think where it's a little more uncertain is what it means to be a commercial garden. And I will say, garden is nowhere defined in the program. And sort of informally, FSA has said farmers should not worry about this rule so long as they're actually selling what they're producing. But I think the kind of lawyer in Stephen and I probably makes us a bit hesitant about that. And so what I would just say is know that that rule exists, but I wouldn't let that deter you if you're wondering if you're too small. I think the key is, are you selling your produce or livestock? But if for some reason you apply for the program and have a problem or get denied because they say you are a garden, please let us know and we will definitely help work through that. So that's the one sort of quirky rule in there, but in general, needs to be produced in the US, marketed for commercial production. And then the third one is it has to be designated by USDA as being eligible. And simply what that means is there is a very long list of commodities that USDA has decided are eligible for this program. And again, it's a much larger list than what existed in CFAP 1. And I'm going to share now with you sort of how USDA has broken down the commodity eligibility. And they have essentially what they have done is they have created 3 larger categories. And as you can see, there's sales crops, there's what are called price trigger crops and livestock, and then flat rate crops. And I point this out because these categories, some don't seem very intuitive when you look at the lists, but these are really important when it comes to how payments are made. And so that's why I'm going to talk about the commodities in terms of these categories. And I also want to point out that really it seems like what USDA is trying to do is they're putting these into groups based on how they determined the eligibility. So for example, we have this first category, sales crops. And I think of this as kind of the catch-all category for CFAP 2. So it includes over 200 different specialty crops. So vegetables, fruits, nuts, honey, maple sap, and these are mostly raw commodities. I think that's important to point out. But then you also have a variety of aquaculture, of nursery and floriculture commodities. And this is where you'll notice that it maybe gets a little confusing conceptually, but there's what USDA calls other livestock. So in this sales category, you have things ranging from turkeys and alpaca to bison, buffalo, goats, quail, rabbits. So there is a wide variety of livestock that are eligible under the sales category, as well as a few miscellaneous things such as goat milk, wool, mink, and tobacco. So again, this is kind of the catch-all category, and we're going to talk in a minute about how the payments are made for this group. I imagine for a lot of folks at this conference, this is probably one of those categories that is more applicable than some of the others. But I do want to mention all just in case you are working with farmers who might be raising a variety of things. So the next category are what are called price trigger crops and livestock. And this category, it has a bizarre name, but actually I think where it's coming from, and this is probably the most closely related to the commodities that were eligible for CFAP 1, but these are all commodities that USDA decided or determined had suffered at least a 5% price decline in the first part of 2020. And so as you can see, there are some standard acreage-based crops, and these are a lot of kind of the larger row crops, things like sorghum, barley, corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton. And here's where, again, it's a bit confusing, but we have also a specific list of livestock. And unlike the livestock in the sales category, this is a much more limited list. So under the price trigger livestock, you have beef cattle, hogs and pigs, and sheep and lamb, and that is it. And I think especially important for this group is that there are no breeding stock eligible. And that is a bit different from CFAP 1. So boars and sows, bulls and cows, rams and ewes, none of those would be eligible for CFAP 2. And in addition, there's some other livestock products. So what USDA calls dairy, which in essence, we're just talking about cow's milk. And then eggs, and that can be shell eggs, frozen, liquid, or dried, as well as broilers. So again, all of these are commodities that by USDA's research had experienced at least a 5% price decline. I will note it's important, no individual farmer needs to show that they experienced that price decline. Again, this is just how this got into the program as being eligible. So you don't have to be able to prove, that your beef cattle sold for, the price reduction was at least 5%. So don't worry about that. Okay, and then our final category, these are called flat rate crops. And as you'll see in a minute, really the name exists because there is just one flat rate that USDA has determined to pay out for all of these crops. Again, these are mainly acreage-based crops, so everything from alfalfa and buckwheat to rye, rice, hemp, sugar beets, sugar cane. So this gives you kind of an overview of the different types of commodities. And now I want to spend a few minutes talking about how payments are made on these. So again, I think that's a big determining factor in whether folks think it is worth applying. So I'm going to kind of go through each category and we'll talk through that. So okay, here we go. The first one are the payments for the sales commodities. And again, this is our category, our catch-all category. So a lot of diversified specialty crop farmers are going to fall within this. And the key here is that USDA and CFAP 2, the payments are based on a farmer's 2019 sales. And especially important here is that it doesn't matter when you raise the crop. So for example, if you harvested a crop in the late fall of 2018 and you held on to it, but you actually sold it in 2019, that would count for purposes of CFAP 2. Conversely, if you harvested something at the end of 2019 and held on to it and you didn't sell it until this year, then that would not be eligible for a payment under this category. So again, we're looking at 2019 sales. And the other, I think, important thing to point out on these is that it's sales of raw commodities. And I think this is especially important, if you're a farmer and let's say, you're milking your cows and you're making cheese, okay, or something like that, you wouldn't be eligible for the price you get for cheese. Or if you have grapes and you're turning it into wine, you would be eligible for the value of the raw grapes, but not the wine. Same with maple syrup versus maple sap. And so keep in mind that what USDA is interested in and the value that you put on your 2019 sales is for your raw commodities. So the way these payments work is you determine what your sales are for 2019, and then USDA has kind of set these predetermined, what they're calling payment factors. And as you can see, hopefully all of you can see this on the screen, the way USDA has set this up is there are 5 categories or 5 ranges that are based on your sales. So for example, if in 2019 you had just under $50,000 in sales of eligible commodities in this sales category, then you would be paid 10.6% of those total sales. Where the payment gets a little trickier is that, let's say you sold $66,000 worth of commodities. If you look at this chart here, it would show that the 50,000 to just under 100,000 is a 9.9% payment rate. But the way USDA factors this is they would actually take the first $49,999 and pay that at the 10.6% rate. And then again, using the example of if you sold 66,000, they would take that remaining roughly $16,001 and pay that at the 9.9%. So, and they just kind of keep doing that. So it works out, you know, to the advantage of the farmer, but just want to make clear that, that it's kind of a step up system for the payments. So that is how the payments for sales commodities worked. And this is for, again, that huge range of commodities. So whether you have flowers or aquaculture or goat milk or, you know, one of 200 different types of fruits or vegetables, this is how the payments will work. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to that price trigger category. And we're going to start with the livestock. And this one, you know, I'll just briefly kind of run through. It's a bit different depending on, you know, what exactly you are producing. But we're going to start with milk. So if you have cow's milk, the way the CFAP 2 payments is they're looking at both the actual and sort of estimated production for 2020. So unlike the sales category, which was really focusing on 2019, with cow's milk, you're looking at 2020 production. And so what they will do is they will ask for your actual production of cow's milk from April 1st to August 31st of this year. And then USDA is going to take that and sort of figure out what your average daily production would be. And they will use that number to estimate what it's likely that you would produce from September 1st through December 31st of this year. And then they pay that at just over a penny per pound or $1.20 per hundredweight, if there are any dairy farmers on the call. And I think the only other thing I want to point out with the dairy is that you can be eligible if you are a seasonal dairy, or if you're a dairy that dissolves after the application, you have submitted an application. I know that was one of the things Stephen mentioned. You do have to be in business when you apply for the program, but if for some reason you dissolve after, you will just need to amend your application and they will prorate for what amounts to your actual production for this year. So that is cow's milk. That's our dairy category. Then moving on to eggs. And again, frozen, liquid, dried, or shelled eggs are all eligible. This one, the way they're figuring it out is essentially 75% of your 2019 production. And so that means so of what you produced in calendar year 2019, and then there is a payment rate that USDA, it's a preset rate that they have. And just to give you an idea, so for shell eggs, it's 5 cents per dozen. For frozen eggs, it's 14 cents per pound. So that's how you would figure out your payment for that. Now, there is a possibility if you are a farmer who just began your egg production business in calendar year 2020, you can still apply, but you will have to use your actual 2020 numbers. So keep that in mind. For broilers, it's a pretty simple calculation. CFAP 2 pays out at just over $1, so $1.01 per head. And this will include any broilers that left the farm for slaughter in calendar year 2020. And again, similar to eggs, if you are a new farmer, so you did not farm at all in 2019, you can get paid for your 2020 production. And then finally, the price trigger livestock. So again, our hogs and pigs, sheep and lamb, and beef cattle. These are based on, and this is where it's a little different, but the farmer, the individual farmer, you get to determine a date anywhere between April 16th and August 31st of this year. And it can be the date with your highest number of inventory. And then you will use that number, and then it will be multiplied again by a payment rate that USDA has set. So for cattle, and regardless of the age of the cattle, it's $55 per head. For hogs and pigs, it's $23 per head. And then for sheep and lambs, it's $27. So again, it doesn't matter the age of the livestock. But once again, breeding stock are not included and not eligible for CFAP 2. So those are the payments for the price trigger livestock. Now moving on to the price trigger crops. So again, are a lot of our standard row crops. The way these are paid out, and this is a little different. So whereas a lot of the categories we've talked about thus far are based on either your sales or your production history, when you are applying for CFAP 2 for an acreage-based crop, such as a price trigger crop here, FSA is going to use what they're calling their acreage reports. So those of you who have worked with FSA in the past will be pretty familiar with these, but it's a form FSA 578, and it has a lot of data on your farm and what you're producing. And the way this works is that when you apply, you will have to have filled out that form. And if you're new, if you've never worked with FSA before, they are saying that they will be happy to work with you to get that form filled out. But then the reason that's important is that form sort of automatically calculates the important factors in the payment. And so the way this payment works is it's going to look at your eligible acres for the crop. And eligible acres are based on what's reported on that form 578. So again, that's a specific term. So your eligible acres times your 2020 APH yield. So this is actually looking at your specific yield, multiplied by a payment rate that USDA has determined. And then also by what USDA calls a crop marketing percentage. And they don't define this very well, but it seems to be what they are estimating is the remaining, percentage of a crop that would be left to be marketed for the remainder of 2020. So they have these 4 aspects of this calculation. You multiply them all together, and that would be your payment for the crop. It is important to know that for these, there is a minimum of $15 an acre. So even if you went through that entire calculation, and let's say it only came out to being $12 an acre, you would automatically be bumped up to $15. So for these price trigger crops, you can't get below $15 an acre if they're eligible. Okay, so moving on, the last category, the flat rate commodities, as the name suggests, it's a pretty simple calculation. It is just $15 per eligible acre. But again, as with the crops we were just talking about, because these are acreage-based crops, so things like alfalfa and hemp, you have to have that FSA form 578, the report of acreage, filled out. So you will need to work with FSA to complete that form if that's something that you don't already have on file with them. But as Stephen emphasized in the beginning, it is perfectly okay if you have never worked with FSA before. You are absolutely eligible. It's just a bit more legwork on the front end for you to apply. So, okay, so those are our 3 main categories and how the payments are structured. And what I'm going to do next is just talk a little bit about the application process and some of the documentation requirements. And I think one of the first, oh yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Lindsay, sorry to break in. Claire just commented in the chat that that we have a lot of folks that are doing flowers in Carolinas, and so, and I told her that definitely that they're eligible. Can you think of anything that sort of would be of special importance for flowers as a sales crop offhand? I'm not thinking of anything, but I just thought if one occurs to you, it'd be something to share.
Well, actually, that's interesting. So no, I think the key is that absolutely floriculture, flowers, a huge range of flowers are eligible. You would be under that first category. So if I can go back, so again, you would be based on your 2019 sales. So I know where we've had some questions, you know, for example, if someone just began their flower operation in 2020, it's going to be trickier because they really want to look at those 2019 sales. So as long as you sold flowers in 2019, you should be good. If you are, you know, want a more specific list, on the farmers.gov website for USDA, they have a frequently asked question page, and they list out specifically the floriculture and horticulture commodities that are eligible. So you can look there. And also, this applies for any category. The website, the USDA website, it's I would say pretty exhaustive for this program. It's worth looking at, but they have what they call a CFAP 2 eligible commodities finder. And what you can essentially do is, and we might be able to put in a link to the chat in a little bit, but you can go to this finder and type in all of the crops that you raise. So if you were curious about a certain flower or a vegetable, and it will tell you both if it's eligible or not, but almost equally as important, it will tell you which category it falls within so that you can understand the payment aspect. So that is a useful tool if you're confused at all about whether something that you're growing or raising is eligible. But in short, I think if you sold flowers in 2019, you should be good to go as far as that's concerned. So, okay. So when we talk about the CFAP 2 application, we're not going to go through it in too much detail, but I wanted to put a couple of the pages up in a way just to emphasize that the application itself can be quite simple. And I think an important thing to understand about the way this program works, and both Stephen and I are going to touch on this a bit, but when you apply, you are mainly self-certifying to either what you sold, what you produced, your inventory. And what that means is, in general, FSA is not going to require when you apply that you produce all of this documentation to show what you sold or what you produced. Now, you'll need that documentation, and Stephen will talk about this a bit more. You'll need it both to determine, you know, what numbers to put down, but as far as the actual application, you are certifying under oath that it's accurate and that it's true. So it is important that you are that you know accurately what you have raised or sold, but you don't need to have a lot of documentation submitted at the time you apply. USDA will be able to ask you for things, but I just wanted to make that clear. And so what you're looking at now is the first part of the application. This is the agreement. So this is where it's saying, you know, you're agreeing that everything was produced in the United States. I circled a couple things, number 6 and number 7. There are a few required documents that you will need to provide when you apply. So in addition to this application, which is Form 3117, there's a few others. There is and they all just have numbers the way USDA works, a CCC 902 form, which is a farm operating plan. This is a pretty standard form. If you work with USDA, it gets information on your farm, and if you haven't filled one out with them before, they have advised to just contact your local FSA office and they'll be happy to help you fill that out. Importantly, you don't actually even need all of it. It's just parts A and B of that form. And then if you are an entity, so if you're a partnership or an LLC, some version of a corporation, there's a form called a CCC 901, and this is just going to get information on the individual members of the entity. So that form, if you are a legal entity, you will need to submit. And then earlier when Stephen was talking about the eligibility for farmers, you know, he mentioned that you have to be below a certain income. And so there are forms that you have to fill out that you certify what your average adjusted gross income is. So that CCC 941 is that form. And then finally, there's 2 more, and Stephen alluded to these. One is called an AD 1026, and this is a conservation compliance form. So this is pretty standard for almost any USDA program. If you are participating, you'll need to certify that you are in compliance with certain wetland or highly erodible land rules that exist. So if you have worked with USDA before and you have filled out this form before, it shouldn't be too difficult, and you may actually not have to fill out a new one. There's what they call a continuous certification. But again, if you're new to USDA, it's something that you'll need to look into, and I would advise just working with your local FSA office on that. And if you do have questions on this, the guide that Stephen and I are working to publish early next week will go into more details about kind of the conservation compliance rules. So if you have any questions, let us know. And then finally, the last form, I wanted to point out that some of you might need to submit if you are applying. And this goes back to what type of commodities that you are applying to the CFAP 2 program for. So if you are applying for any of the acreage-based crops, so again, those price trigger crops, a lot of the row crops, corn, soy, sorghum, or any of the flat rate crops like hemp or alfalfa. Anything that's based on your acreage, you'll have to fill out that FSA 578 form, the report of acreage. And you won't actually even be able to submit your application without that being filled out. So I just want to emphasize that, because for some folks, it can be, a 15-minute process to apply. If you're, for example, under the sales category and, you don't have these extra forms to fill out, it can be pretty quick. But if you are new to working with USDA and you have an acreage-based crop, just know, or we would advise kind of reaching out sooner rather than later to get that paperwork underway. So, okay, going back to the application form, just a couple other things I wanted to point out. So this is the first part. Again, you're agreeing to supply these required documents. You're agreeing that it's produced in the US. The next part is really where you're just filling out the relevant information. And this is what I just wanted to point out is pretty simple. So, as you can see, for example, in part D here for the eggs and broiler production, you are just listing the number of head or the pounds of eggs, or for shell eggs, in dozens, how many eggs you produced in 2019. And it really is that simple. And then for those of you, that big catch-all category, the sales, so the flour farmers who might be here, you're going to fall under this part F category, the sales commodities. And I think the important thing to point out here is, although that huge kind of wide range, everything from goat milk to flowers to fish, all of those fall under one category. When you go to fill out the CFAP 2 application, remember, these are commodities where they're just looking at your sales for 2019, but USDA will have you break them out by kind of subcategories, and you can see that here. So any aquaculture will need to be listed separately, your sales, then your sales for the crops. And you'll note it says excluding part G. And really what that means is excluding any of those acreage-based, so those flat rate crops or those price trigger crops. So again, that's why these kind of seemingly arbitrary categories become pretty important. But so you would put your 2019 sales for your fruits and your vegetables separately, and then your nursery and floriculture, your miscellaneous, so that included things like milk and or goat milk and mink, other livestock, so your turkeys, your quail, and then tobacco. So so you do need to be able to break it out, which could be a little more complicated, but you're just putting the number in. And for now, that's all you need to do. And the same goes jumping up to part E with the livestock. So if you have your cattle or hogs, pigs, sheep or lambs, you're choosing that highest inventory and you're writing that number down. So again, I just use this to say that the application itself, depending on your operation, can be fairly simple to fill out. And besides those additional few forms that are required right away, that is what you'll need. And you do, I don't think I said this, but you do have 60 days from the time you submit your application to submit any of that required documentation that FSA needs. But it's important to know that they won't make any payment until that documentation is in. So it's to your advantage to kind of submit things as quickly as you can. So, okay, I feel like I have talked a lot on this, and I'm going to turn it over now to Stephen to talk a little bit about what happens after you apply and what else FSA can ask you for in terms of documentation.
Actually, Lindsay, we had a question about processing, and I think asking a little bit for a little bit more of an explanation about the difference between the raw commodity and the processing. And the question actually was is about cheese producers, which of course is extra complicated in the sense that it makes a difference. How you get paid for milk makes a difference of whether it's cow milk or other milk. And so if you're just an everyday, no, nothing's everyday. If you're selling milk to a cooperative or creamery, cow's milk, you're in a category where you're going to get paid based on the pounds. If, on the other hand, you're doing goats, and then your processing question comes into play. So, Lindsay, do you want to just maybe elaborate a little bit about the whole processing issue?
Yeah, because that is a really important one because it goes for so many different types of commodities. So again, when everything I'm about to say is only relevant to those commodities in that sales category, so that big catch-all. So diversified farmers with fruits and vegetables, maple sap, and goat milk, which I think is where the processing comes into play for cheesemakers. So what USDA has said is they are only going to make payments on your 2019 sales of raw commodities. So let's say you have goat milk and you turn it into cheese. You can be eligible for CFAP too, but what you're going to need to be able to do is you're going to need to be able to document and be able to verify in case FSA asks what the value of your raw goat milk is versus the value of your cheese. And unfortunately, there is not a lot of specific guidance on how you should break that out. I think, I was looking at their frequently asked questions, and there was one that I think maybe gives you an idea of what they're looking for. But for example, let's take a hypothetical that you grow grapes but you turn them into wine. And so, again, because wine is processed and not the raw commodity, you can't get paid for the sales of wine. But let's say you also, in part of your winemaking business, you buy raw grapes from your neighbors. What USDA has said is, for example, in this scenario, if you're trying to figure out the value of your raw grapes, it would be legitimate. It would be an accurate way to break that out is to determine what you pay your neighbor for theirs. So you would use your quantity of what you're raising, but you would use the value that those raw grapes are worth. I think similarly, as long as you have any sort of conceivably legitimate way of breaking it down, and I recognize that this is not that helpful. There are not formulas for everything. USDA, they put out a couple conversion factors for, I believe, if you have maple sap and you're turning it into maple syrup, there's a conversion factor that they suggest you can use to figure out the raw value. But really, it's just doing your best to come up with a calculation and being ready if FSA were to ask you to kind of show them how you came up with your numbers, being prepared to say, this is how I figured the raw value. And that it's important to recognize that when we're talking about raw versus processed, that also means that if if your packaging adds value, or if you're kind of changing its form in any way, that you kind of need to work backwards and figure out that raw value. So, and I don't know, Stephen, if there's anything you want to add on that.
Well,
no,
I guess I'd love to ask a clarifying question there then. So you don't have to show that you bought milk from yourself to turn into cheese. You can simply determine a calculation and support it of what the value of that raw commodity was.
Yep,
Okay.
and I think Stephen's going to go into a bit more detail on that kind of supporting documentation. And I know I have emphasized a lot that, right, you don't have to have all this documentation right away when you apply, but it is really important that you are able to show how you come up with these numbers, because the fact is they can ask for it. But you are exactly right. You just need a way that you have determined that raw value that is reasonable. And again, that's a little subjective, but that's kind of the best advice we can give.
And so if you're making strawberry jam from your strawberries and you also retail the strawberries, you could use that information to assess the value of the strawberries that you used for jam.
That's actually a perfect, if you sell at the farmer's market, even looking at what your neighboring farmers are selling, let's say you do strawberry jam and you don't sell your raw strawberries, but if you can, if there's a neighboring farmer who sells it for X amount, that would be a reasonable way. So yes, anything like that you can point to that says, this is a reasonable amount to expect I would have made if I had sold this as a raw commodity.
Great. Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's assume we've got an application in. Now what? First thing to remember is that, let's suppose that you did an application and then you thought afterwards, I didn't include a commodity that I probably should have. Is it too late to include it? And the answer is no, it's not too late. You can revise that application anytime up until the final deadline. And so if you neglected something, it's okay, just kind of do the same thing, and you'll have to sign it again, but it's okay to add commodities to it. So that said, if you have problems, FSA has phone numbers you can apply. They will say, please contact them and they will help you. We hear sort of mixed things about that. Oftentimes folks are very helpful, sometimes less so, but you should know that their own rules say they're supposed to help you. And then one final point about just sort of dealing with them is USDA has something called a receipt for service. And it's something that farm advocates have long sought, because one of the problems that has occurred when dealing with USDA is if there's no paper record of your interaction with them, it can be unclear what really happened, and people will say, oh, hey, I went in and asked and they told me this or that, and USDA will say, well, we had no record of that. We don't have any idea what you're talking about. Well, now it's a rule. If you interact with them, they are supposed to give you a receipt for service. Now, normally that would only be the case if you went into the office, but during COVID-19 crisis, their rules now say that if you call them and ask them, you call the local office and say, what about my strawberry jam? And they tell you what they think the answer is, they should send you a receipt for service that describes sort of what your interaction was. So just not to be the paranoid lawyer, but that's, I think, a valuable thing that should be occurring. So we have applied. Make sure you do it by December 11th. What happens now? The answer is USDA will review your application, and the main bulk of the review is going to happen at that local office, mainly county offices, but some of the counties have consolidated. And as you know, you're going to self-certify your production, your inventory, your prices, whatever it is that you're putting on your application, which means you're saying this is what it is and signing. USDA is going to review that. They, according to their own rules, are going to try to decide whether what you submitted is reasonable. They also have the power to ask you for backup documents that show how you reach these conclusions. They're not going to be very happy if you just say, well, I just kind of keep it all in my head. That's actually a no-no for this program. You need to have backup information to show how you reach those numbers, your inventory, your sales, your production. So USDA can ask you for those documents, and when they look at them, they are going to want to know that your application is accurate based on those documents. So what we're hearing is that there are a fair number of people that do get asked to provide documents. There are a fair number of people that don't. So you just should know, though, that you need to have some background documentation over what you're putting in that application, even though you don't have to submit it with the application itself. So USDA is going to look at your application. They're going to try to decide whether it's reasonable and whether, based on any documents they ask for, it's accurate. Then they're going to do one of three things. They're going to either approve it as it is, send it off, and what we're hearing is that people are being paid quickly, relatively quickly. They may do what they call an adjustment. They may change the numbers to get them to be more accurate and reasonable, and it may well affect the total amount that you can be paid. This is happening to a lot of people. They get a check that's not what they expected it to be, but they still do get a check. The third thing USDA might do at the local level is deny your application. Just say this person's not eligible, or there's no evidence at all that they did the things that they said they did. And that would mean that you would not get paid. So USDA rules say, and this is true for both CFAP 1 and CFAP 2, that if USDA either denies your application for CFAP or adjusts your application, they need to tell you in a letter. The letter must explain how they reached that conclusion, and it must give you the right to an appeal. Our understanding is for CFAP 1, basically nobody has received one of these letters, so which is odd, let's just say. And it will be also true for CFAP 2 that any of these alterations they make, denial or adjustment, you're going to have the right to appeal that decision. So it's one important thing to keep in mind. We anticipate that sometime soonish, maybe coincidentally, now that it's after November 5th, people will start to get denial letters from CFAP 1, and in the end, they will get them for CFAP 2 as well. So that's sort of the way their decision-making process works. The other thing to keep in mind is that USDA is saying that they have the right to do what they are calling spot checks. And when we read their materials closely, this is what we think that means. The national USDA office, folks in Washington, D.C., are going to go to individual states and just, in theory, randomly check to make sure that the system has been running as it's supposed to. So the internal rules at USDA say these spot checks will be selected randomly. They also say, however, that the local office can recommend to the national office that certain applications be spot checked. This makes Lindsay and me a little uneasy. You know, how are they going to decide who to spot check, why? It leaves some room in there for something, you know, for some discretion that makes us uncomfortable, but it's a part of the rules, and you should know that actually even after you're paid, there's a chance that you will be spot checked. So it's all the more important to keep those records that we're going to talk about here in a minute and save them, because you may need them later on. So documentation. You submit the application as Lindsay showed you, and you keep hearing us say, keep your documents. You must have records to support your yields, your inventory, your prices received. What in the world do they mean? And there's not a super clear answer. What USDA does is give us some examples of the sorts of things that they'd like to see when they ask you for documentation. And I think the most important thing to remember here is they don't want to hear, oh, I remember it. They want to see some sort of record that exists. Now, that could be something from another party. You know, it could be hauling records for cattle, let's say, or it could be receipts for sales. So there's some obvious things that you can picture. But let's say also that you need documentation for poultry or livestock. Well, just start to think about where there's a paper trail for what you did that shows that you did that production. So, do you have any veterinarian's bills? Do you have feed receipts, feed costs? Do you, again, if you have cattle, you bought salt blocks or mineral blocks. I mean, all that sort of thing helps establish a record that shows that you did this production. Same with the sales. And what I also think that, and this is a part of USDA rules too, it's okay for this documentation to be records that you created yourself. It doesn't mean it's automatically worthless just because you did your own records to show that you had a production or an inventory. But here's the thing, it needs to be what USDA calls contemporaneous. That is to say, if you are going to say that on October 20th, you had X sales of flowers, you need to be able to say that this is a record you created on October 20th. They do not want you to, at the end of the season, just kind of write something up. What's best in their eyes is documentation that you, if you're going to create it, that you do at the time that these things occurred. A sale, a snapshot inventory, where you say these are the animals that I had, or this is the corn production that I had. You need something, and it's okay if it's your own writing and your own record, your own diary, however you would do it. Just do it at the time. And I think that you're probably going to be in good shape. If you're doing a contract, they're going to want to see a contract. If they have questions about whether you had an ownership interest in it, that's something that you might be able to document too. So again, and for sales receipts, deposit slips, just think about where there's a paper record, and that's what you want to be able to produce. And so you really want to keep them. That's the crucial thing, because they can come back later. Let's say you get a denial. As I said, you're going to get a letter, a denial or an adjustment. You're going to get a letter, and it's going to tell you why they did what they did. You're going to have the right to an appeal, and USDA has an appeal system. It's not perfect, but it's for real. It's not just a sham. Lots of people appeal USDA decisions and win. And when you appeal USDA decision and win, the decision is reversed. It's changed. And so there's a whole process by which this happens. We write about this in a guide that we're going to publish next week. Got what, I think 10 pages or 8 pages or something, sort of on the outline, this sort of basics of how an appeal system works. You're going to be able to go in and talk to the county committee. You can mediate, you can appeal up the ladder at USDA, and then go to what they call their National Appeals Division, which is actually a little bit like a mini court. And a lot of people do it. A lot of people get some help to do it, be it a lawyer or an advocate. A lot of people do it themselves. Your burden when you do this is going to be to show that USDA was wrong. And the thing to remember with the appeals is you can only appeal things that are sort of about your own adverse decision, as USDA calls it. So let's say you don't like a certain rule that USDA has, like that breeding stock is not eligible for CFAP2. You can't appeal that. That's a broad rule that applies to everybody. You can appeal a decision, though, where let's say, not to be mean to USDA, but let's say you have 2 steers and they say the steers are breeding stock. Well, no. And if they actually do that, then you can appeal, and let's hope that you would win. So that's an appeal system. It's not super easy to negotiate, but I'll say again, it's for real. One other thing that we wanted to briefly mention is about discrimination and other difficulties that people sometimes have at USDA. So in this country, oftentimes, as we know, there's an assumption that all farmers are white men. We all know that's not true. But what's also been a long-standing fact is that if you're not a white man and have tried to farm in the United States, you have often been subjected to discrimination. And the thing that we really want to emphasize here is that that discrimination is not only wrong, it's illegal. And again, I hate to pick on USDA, but USDA has had a very long history of permitting discrimination at a local level in these county offices when they deal with farmers. And in our guide, we have, again, a few pages explaining how you can file a discrimination complaint with USDA if you feel that you've been discriminated against. But I'll say one more time, it's not only wrong, it's illegal. I'm not going to say I have high praise for the discrimination complaint process at USDA, but it does exist. It's a place to file a complaint and to show that you were treated differently when you should not have been. So that's discrimination. Lindsay, what have I missed, or are we ready for questions?
I think we might be ready for questions, and I'm going to go ahead and put our contact information on the screen just in case folks want it. But so you can either email Stephen or I if you have questions going forward or issues with the application process. As Stephen mentioned, we're going to be publishing a guide on the program next week that'll be available on our website. And then we also have a farmer hotline. So, not just related to CFAP 2, but if there are other issues that you're experiencing that you might need some help with, feel free to call that. But yeah, I think if there are questions, I think we are here and happy to answer them as best we can.
We're a small, cozy group. In my mind, you could just unmute yourself and just ask. But if you feel better using the chat, please do that.
So this has been super helpful and spotlighted some new things for me. One question with respect to the record keeping. I know lots of direct market producers who grow fruits and vegetables and flowers. They keep track of their production of those fruits and vegetables and flowers, and they take it to the farmer's market and they sell it, and they don't distinguish in the records that they keep. They just, hey, I made $1,000 at the farmer's market today selling, and that was flowers and fruit and vegetables both. So how do you, and given that they have to segregate these two items in the application, what are the things that USDA is going to look for to allow them to make that distinction?
I'll give it a shot, Stephen, and then you feel free to chime in. I would say, again, the key is that the numbers that you are putting down are reasonable and to the extent that you can make them accurate. So, I think one way in the hypothetical you gave, if someone knows their total production for the year and they know, okay, I sold all of my carrots. I know what I sell my carrots for. That even if I can't say I sold X number at this price on this day, I can show you the production and that they, what I sold in that year and how much I sell them for. And so if you could do that for each of the categories that exists on the application, for your floriculture and horticulture, your aquaculture, your crops. So that would be one way of doing it. I'm trying to think if any other ideas come to mind, but yeah, you don't need, if you have the daily log and want to go through it, that's great. But I think it is enough if you have a total number and the price you sell it for that crop, that would work as well. Stephen, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we need to kind of thread the needle a little bit in the sense that we don't want to freak people out so they don't apply. You do not have to have a perfect record of every single dollar that went through the farmer's market. You need to convince the county committee that it's reasonable. And for most people, reasonable is going to be adequate. If they give you a hard time and start requiring you to do this sort of outrageous detailed inventories and this and that, send us an email. I mean, I think that's when you can appeal, and I think you have a very good chance of winning. So again, I don't want to discourage people because they don't have perfect, immaculate records. On the other hand, if you've got nothing and they start asking, you're going to be in trouble. You need to be able to point to something. So really, I think if you stop and think about it, I'm kind of repeating myself here, but anything that's on paper that shows that you produced, that you had these input costs, you didn't do that for nothing. And you didn't just toss it for no reason. And then you can sort of show, okay, this is what I normally get for, as Lindsay said, carrots or cut flowers or whatever. You're creating a record there, which we think should be and will be adequate. And if you have problems, we'd be interested to know. I mean, we probably can't be your lawyer and do your appeal, but we can help you. We can help you look through stuff and try to figure out what a good argument is for you. I hope that helps. I mean, the problem is with USDA stuff, and this is sort of the blessing and the curse of USDA, is we're talking about hundreds of local offices, and they each have different human beings, and they're in different parts of the country, and some people are competent and kind, some people are incompetent and jerks, and that's kind of what we face. And yeah. But the money is there. I just feel like what we're hearing is there are people that are getting paid, and we don't want anybody to do it that puts themselves at risk. But I would hope that people are not discouraged by these requirements.
Absolutely. Something else, you all brought up the distinction of gardens and quote commercial gardens. I mean, I presume there that maybe the lesson is when you're talking with FSA or putting together your documentation that you just don't use that word.
That's a good start. We think the whole thing is just kind of bizarre, and because we know from the outset that if it's not commercial, if you're not selling it, you're not eligible anyway. So we don't really understand why this is even in there at all. It wasn't not in CFAP 1. We've heard people, as Lindsay said, sort of talk like they're sort of ignoring it, which is a dangerous thing to depend on. But to me, anybody who sells is not a garden, or at least if they are a garden, they should still be eligible for the program. I will say, if you or anybody you know about gets denied because you're called a commercial garden, we would be very interested in hearing about that. And I think that's something to go toe to toe with them on. To me, that's nonsense. And I don't know where it came from. I don't know what it means. There's no definition, which is inexcusable. But we'd be very interested in helping people work through that. Lindsay, add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is I definitely don't have that be a reason not to apply. So if you are concerned about that, just let's recognize it's vague. There's some uncertainty, but absolutely still apply if you meet the other eligibility requirements, and then just let us know if there's an issue.
I've got more questions, but I don't want to hog it. Please, if other folks could pipe up, we welcome it. So here's something else I've heard asked. When it comes to nursery crops, what about transplants? Whether it's a farmer who sells who thins their leafy greens crops and sells those at the farmer's market, or producers of hemp who produce hemp seedlings that they sell to others for transplants. Any sense of whether or not those would be nursery crops?
Ooh, that is a really good question. I mean, I think the hemp is an interesting example because it definitely falls within the flat rate crop category. And I would have to do more research to figure out if that's also independently, because essentially if you were selling it as a seedling, it would fall under the sales category. So if that's something that folks are, interested or curious about, we can look into that. But I think hemp would also have to independently fall within the sales category for that example of the seedling. And as far as starts, my sense would be that is still the raw commodity. I think one interesting thing, and Stephen, please chime in if you have a different thought or additional thoughts, but is, when they do describe what raw is, one of the distinguishing words they use is, not processed or packaged. So if there is a lot of expense that you're putting into kind of the packaging of it to sell, that's something to think about. Yeah, Stephen, what's your gut on that?
Yeah, so I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but let's say you do starts for peppers in a greenhouse or something. And it sounds like what you're describing is if you sell those to somebody else who then plants them and then ultimately sells them at a farmer's market. I think everybody involved is eligible from what I read. I mean, as Lindsay says, it's always worth a double check. But I think that if you do the starts in a greenhouse and then sell, I think you're eligible. And if you buy them from somebody who's doing the start and you raise them and sell them at a farmer's market, I think you're eligible too. Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, if you think about it, like other commodities like livestock, it's sort of different because with livestock, you're sort of picking a date where you have an inventory and they're either sort of in or out. But here, there's no single date for a pepper, where it's somewhere along the commodity chain. So, I mean, I wouldn't, I think, boy, my guess is you're going to be okay, actually. I mean, is that common? I mean, I would have thought that a lot of people do the starts and then plant them themselves, and that must be common, but it sounds like there are people who sell them, which, like, is a new one on me.
Especially,
but I
like
think,
I say, when they're thinning the crop, right? They got a bunch of starts of beets and radishes, but okay, we're thinning them out. It is a lot of innovative producers out there saying, hey, there's value here, and especially this year, for instance, with COVID and people wanting to garden more. So yeah, I definitely see that happening in markets in our area.
I mean, it's always dangerous to speak before you feel totally confirmed, but I think that's a go. I'd give it it's certainly a good faith. It's not like you're trying to cheat them. You're following what you think their rules are. Let them say no, and I think you'd be fine, actually.
And the key would just be with that example, that it would be those 2019 sales, unless you are a new farmer.
Right.
Anything else you all are hearing from other parts of the country about other sort of trends of issues or opportunities?
Well, we've been, I hate to bring it back the garden thing. We've been really pushing on what the heck this garden thing actually means. And we've gotten no good answers. Minnesota State Office of FSA says kind of ignore it. But we know people that have written formal list of questions to USDA, including this, and they just kind of skate right past it. So I don't know. It's a little, I mean, you should add in, Lindsay. I mean, we've heard everything from people that are great to people like FSA people basically not even knowing what the program is about, which is horrifying. It's sort of USDA, a little bit all over. Lindsay, what would you say?
Yeah, well, not necessarily related to that, but I would just say, if you haven't looked at the website, they don't answer everything, but it is actually, they have a lot of information on there. And I think one thing I didn't mention is there is one of the ways you can apply, in addition to you can go into the office or talk to them or fill out an application online, but there is something that it's an Excel worksheet that you type in the numbers and it'll populate your application so you can print it off and sign it. So you can get a sense of what you would get paid. So there's a lot of, I feel like they've tried to do a good job at making some user-friendly resources that help you determine where your eligibility is. So I would just encourage folks to look on the website for some questions. And then some things like, what's raw versus processed, some things are just in that gray area where you do the best you can and do it in good faith and have, a reason for it.
Well, we are just sorry we can't be in lovely Carolina on a November day. We're here in Minnesota. It's a nice day today, but it's going to snow again soon, and so.
Yes, it is a shame. We are having some really nice weather today. That's for sure. But hopefully we'll be able to be back in person for this one of these days soon. But
it's really a pleasure to do stuff with you guys. So
awesome. Well, Lindsay, Stephen, this has been super helpful. Thank you so much for all this information. This really has been very enlightening and helps helps us in our outreach for sure. So thank you for joining us. Thanks everybody for being here on the call. And of course, we're recording this and we'll be sharing it out to folks as well. So we really appreciate your time and wish everyone a great rest of the day.
Feel free to contact us with questions.
Will do.
Thanks.